woke up, as he always did, before the sun. Not from habit. Habit implied something chosen and repeated until it became automatic. This was older than habit. This was the body remembering a time when the darkness before dawn was dangerous, when the light meant you had survived another night, and survival still meant something. The body remembered even when the mind had grown too weary to care about the distinction. His name, currently, was Elias. It had been other things. In the language that preceded language, the system of sound and gesture and shared breath that the ones he'd grown up among had used before anyone thought to carve meaning into stone, he had been called something that translated, approximately, to the one who remains. Later names had come and gone with the civilizations that produced them. He'd been a word in Sumerian that meant endurance, a Roman cognomen meaning old stone, a Norse epithet he'd rather not revisit. For the last 80 years he'd been Elias, which was a name that asked nothing of him, which was, at this stage, the primary quality he looked for in a name. He sat on the edge of the bed in the gray pre-dawn and looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man in his late 30s, which was where the body had stopped and stayed, somewhere in the third millennium before the Common Era, during a fever that should have killed him and had instead done something else entirely, something for which no language, living or dead, had ever produced an adequate word. The hands were unremarkable, moderately calloused, the kind of hands that suggested work without specifying what kind. He had been careful, over the millennia, to keep them that way. Outside the window, the city was beginning its morning argument with itself. Traffic. The distant compression of a garbage truck. A dog. The specific urban birdsong of pigeons who had long since stopped believing in anything either. He stood up and went to make coffee. The apartment was on the 14th floor of a building that had gone up in 1987, which made it, by the standards of everything Elias had ever occupied, essentially newborn. He had lived here for 6 years, which was approximately the tenure he allowed himself in any one place before the neighbors began to notice that he wasn't aging and the paperwork began to accumulate its inconsistencies. 6 years was enough time to become familiar with a place without becoming attached to it. He had learned, over a very long time, to calibrate these things. He made coffee with the automatic precision of someone performing a ritual drained of belief. Ground the beans, measured the water, waited. He had watched the first domesticated grain be planted. He had stood in the fields, had helped, in fact, in the early years when he still participated, when the world was still a thing he felt he was part of, rather than a thing he was watching through glass, and pressed seeds into dark earth with his own hands, and felt the specific electricity of that, the understanding that something had changed, that the long wandering was over, that humanity had decided to stay. He had felt it as a beginning. He poured the coffee and stood at the window and watched the city brighten. That was the thing about living long enough. Everything that existed now had a before. The city had a before. The window glass had a before. The coffee had a before. A long and traveled history of cultivation and trade and colonization and commodity markets that Elias had watched unspool across centuries like a thread being pulled from a garment. He knew where everything came from. He knew what it had cost. This was not, it turned out, a gift. He had conquered, once. This was the fact about himself that he turned over least often, the way you avoid pressing a bruise, not because it no longer hurt, but because the hurt had become so familiar that engaging with it felt redundant. He had raised armies and moved them across land that had no names yet for the places it contained. He had built things, walls, roads, systems of governance that were brutal by later standards and revolutionary by the standards of their time. He had believed, with the full and uncomplicated force of a person who had not yet learned what believing cost, that he was building something permanent, that the shape he was pressing into the world would hold. None of it had held. Not the walls, eroded, buried, occasionally excavated by archaeologists who published papers about anonymous prehistoric construction and argued about dates in journals Elias had once, in a particularly masochistic decade, subscribed to. Not the roads, long since subsumed into different roads, different systems, different empires with different gods who had also not lasted. Not the governance, not the language, not the names he had given to rivers and mountains, and the particular arrangement of stars he'd used to navigate, all of it renamed, relayered, overwritten by the endless palimpsest of human civilization pressing its new meanings over the old ones. He had been, at various points, a philosopher and a soldier and a merchant and a monk and a cartographer and a physician and a dozen other things, accumulating knowledge the way water accumulates in a vessel, filling it, until the vessel was full and the new knowledge just spilled over the sides and was lost. He knew more than any human alive. He had forgotten more than any human alive. Both of these facts had long since ceased to feel like anything. He finished the coffee, washed the cup, placed it back in the cabinet. By 9 in the morning he was outside, which was the part of each day he had come to think of as the performance. The world expected a man of approximately 37 to be somewhere, to be doing something, to be in motion toward a purpose. Elias performed this. He walked. He looked like a person walking with destination. The city in the morning had a particular texture, the urgency of people for whom time was running out, which is to say all of them, which is to say the thing that made them, even now, even after everything, briefly bearable to watch. They moved with the unconscious efficiency of creatures who believed their errands mattered, their meetings mattered, the specific coffee from the specific shop on the specific corner of their specific morning mattered. A woman argued quietly into her phone outside a dry cleaner's, her free hand moving in sharp, emphatic arcs. Two men in hard hats stood over an open section of pavement, looking down into it with the focused gravity of people regarding something important. A child was being extracted from a stroller by a parent whose patience was visibly finite, and the child was resisting with the full philosophical commitment of someone for whom this moment was the only moment. Elias watched them. He did this carefully, from a distance, with the studied neutrality he had developed across centuries of practice, the particular emotional register he occupied in the years when caring was too costly and contempt was too exhausting, the flat middle ground of observation without investment. It did not always hold. There were days, fewer now but still occasionally, the way a tooth that should have stopped aching still occasionally ached, when one of them would do something that broke through the neutrality. A small thing, usually. Never the grand gestures. The grand gestures he had seen so many times, they had become a kind of inventory. It was always the small things. A man stopping on the pavement to help a stranger retrieve something dropped. Two old people on a bench sharing something from a paper bag, not talking, just sitting in the specific ease of people who had been beside each other long enough that silence was a form of conversation. A teenager alone on a wall, headphones in, face tilted up toward the sky with the pure and private quality of someone experiencing something they hadn't found words for yet. Those ones still got through. Not always, but sometimes. He hated that they still got through. It would have been easier if they didn't. He ate lunch at a place he'd been going to for 3 years, a small restaurant run by a family whose name he knew and whose faces he had watched change with the incremental slowness that faces change when you see them regularly. The father's hair now mostly gray, the daughter who helped on weekends 2 inches taller than when he'd first sat at this table. They knew him as a quiet regular who tipped well and ordered the same thing and never caused difficulty. He was, to them, a minor and stable feature of their landscape, which was all he ever allowed himself to be anymore. The food was good. It had always been good. This was the family's 3rd year of operation and the quality had not slipped, which he noted with the same impassive satisfaction with which he noted anything that lasted. He ate slowly, looked out the window. The afternoon was assembling itself outside, the light going from the sharp clarity of morning into something softer and more ambiguous. He thought, as he sometimes did in the middle of ordinary moments, about Mara. Not the Mara from the story he'd once told himself about a woman in the valleys east of what was now the Black Sea, though there had been such a woman and she had been important in the way that people are important when you are young enough to believe importance is permanent. No. A different Mara, a woman he had known 40 years ago in this same city, in a different apartment on a different street, during one of his periodic surrenders to the possibility of closeness. He had told himself, going in, that he knew what he was doing, that he could manage it. He had been wrong about this, as he was always wrong about this, as he would always be wrong about this because the species of wrongness in question was not correctable by experience. Knowing that a thing would hurt had never once prevented the thing from hurting. She had been a painter. She had been funny in a way that had surprised him, which almost nothing did anymore. She had known, toward the end, that something about him was not right, Not wrong, exactly, but not right. The way certain equations don't resolve into whole numbers no matter how you approach them. She hadn't asked. He had loved her for not asking, and he had loved her in the other way too, the way that he periodically and against his better judgment allowed himself. And she had died at 71 of something in her lungs that moved quickly, and he had sat with her in the last days, and held her hand, and felt the familiar approach of the grief that had no end and no floor and no door out. He had moved cities shortly after. He always moved cities shortly after. He finished his lunch, paid, left. The afternoon he spent in a library, which was the closest thing he had to a practice, not prayer, not meditation, but the act of sitting among accumulated human knowledge with the full awareness of all that it did not contain. He read a history of the Bronze Age collapse with the idle attention of someone reading about their own neighborhood. He corrected 2 factual errors in his head and said nothing. He always said nothing. He had learned, after several costly experiments in earlier centuries, that appearing to know too much about the past was its own kind of visibility, and visibility was the enemy of continuance. A student at the next table was struggling with something, her pen moving in frustrated circles at the margin of her notes, her face doing the specific thing faces do when understanding is almost there but not quite. He watched her from the corner of his eye, watched the moment it arrived, the small, involuntary straightening, the pen stilling, the almost imperceptible exhale of someone who has found what they were looking for. He looked back at his book. These were the transactions he permitted himself now. Observations, small witnessed moments of other people's lives, consumed from a careful distance, the way you consume the warmth of a fire you are not allowed to approach. It was not enough. It was what there was. He had made his peace with the gap between these two things in the same way he had made his peace with everything else, not by closing it, but by learning to stand in it without falling. Evening came the way evenings come, without asking. He cooked dinner because the body required it, a simple thing, something with rice and vegetables, standing at the stove in the kitchen of the apartment that was and would remain fundamentally not his, that he would vacate in 2 years and leave no meaningful trace in. And he thought about the fire he had once stood at, truly stood at, close enough for the heat to be the primary fact of existence. Somewhere in the long dark of the pre-agricultural world, surrounded by people who would all be dust inside of a century, and how that fire had felt like the center of everything, like all meaning radiated outward from that point of light and warmth in gathered bodies. He ate at the table, alone. The city outside the window performed its evening version of itself, the light shifting from functional to atmospheric, the noise changing register. He washed the dishes. He sat in the chair by the window as the dark came in, and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of discipline, the emptying of a vessel that had been full for so long that fullness no longer felt like anything. He was not happy. He was not unhappy. He was the thing you become when you have outlived the scale on which those words have meaning. Outside, the city kept going. Someone laughed somewhere below. A real laugh, the uncontrolled kind, the kind that escapes before the person can decide whether to allow it. And the sound rose up through the evening air and reached him at the window. And for a moment, just a moment, it landed. He sat with it. Then it was gone, absorbed into the general noise of a world that did not know he was listening, that had never known he was listening, that would continue not knowing long after everyone who had laughed that laugh and everyone who had heard it was finished. He stayed at the window a while longer. Then he went to bed. Then he lay in the dark and waited, as he had always waited, as he would always wait, for the morning he had not yet decided what to do with.